Good afternoon. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and it's a pleasure to welcome you here, physically here in the William G. McGowan Theater, and those of you who are joining us on C-SPAN and on our YouTube channel. Today we're going to hear about War Plan Red, America's plan to invade the nation that shares with the United States the longest international border in the world. Our author is Kevin Lippert, who describes how both the United States and Canada, actually Canada first, had drawn up plans in the 1920s and the 1930s to invade each other. The U.S. plan was declassified in 1974. To put things in perspective, Kevin takes us through the history of the rivalry between the colonies, the United States, and what was once called British North America. Before we go any further, I'd like to tell you about several programs coming up very soon in this auditorium. Tonight at 7, we'll continue our series with Supreme Court Justices with tonight's guest, Justice Samuel Alito. Yale law professor and constitutional scholar Emil Reed Amar will lead the discussion focusing on ideas, viewpoints, and issues related to the Constitution and their impact on the American people. And on Wednesday, November 4th at noon, Betty Boyd Caroli will discuss her new book about the 36th president and his wife, Lady Bird and Lyndon, the hidden story of a marriage that made a president. If you want to know more about these and all of our upcoming public programs, consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies of the calendar in the lobby as well as sign-up sheets where you can receive it by regular mail or email. Our guest today is Kevin Lippert. Kevin was born in Leeds, England, but grew up in the United States, in Ohio, and attended Princeton University, where he studied history and architecture. In 1981, he founded Princeton Architectural Press, a publisher of books on architecture, art, design, and visual culture, which he's run for the past 34 years. Today, he lives in New York's Hudson Valley with his wife, daughter, and 2 sons, one of whom is an officer cadet in the British Army. Regarding the topic of his book, Lippert told a Boston Globe correspondent that today the 2 nations, United States and Canada, are for all intents and purposes one country, a situation they have been moving towards since being allies in World War II. The Rochester, Minnesota Post-Bulletin said Lippert's book has revived interest in the long-forgotten plan since a presidential candidate set a fence along the Canadian border with something we could legitimately consider. Ladies and gentlemen, Kevin Lippert.
Thank you very much. I'd like to thank David and Douglas for inviting me here, and to you for either sharing or sacrificing your lunch hour to learn a little bit about some archival history, which I hope you find interesting, maybe even a little bit humorous. I want to start by telling you a little bit about how this project came about. As David said, I got a degree in history, so like most people with degrees in history, I needed to formulate a plan B as far as a career. So after a trip through architecture school, I ended up in publishing, where I spent a lot of my days worrying about what kinds of books might appeal to people. And one of those conversations I had with our Canadian distributor, who asked me, well, are you working on any books that might appeal to Canadians? And I said, well, I don't know, what appeals to Canadians? And she said, well, and I don't want to misquote her, but I believe she said, Canadians are always worried about what Americans think about them. And I said, I don't know, I don't think we have anything in the plans. And then the next day almost, I saw this article. And I thought, well, there you go. That says something about how we feel about Canada. We don't even care enough about them to have a plan to invade. We liked Iraq enough to invade them, but Canada, our friendly neighbor, apparently just not as interesting. And then the Pentagon says, no, there are no plans to invade Canada. And then somebody said, maybe we should invade Canada. We can pay for Obamacare. So it was starting to sound like a teenage boy who tells all his friends, no, I don't like that girl, even though he spends all his time thinking about her. So it turns out, of course, that there was, in fact, a plan to invade Canada, and that's War Plan Red, which was unearthed in 1974 by a Canadian journalist who came into this building and asked John E. Taylor, who, your former director and I think a kind of a legend in the archives universe. He just said, "What's the weirdest document you have here?" To which Taylor said, without hesitation, "Oh, War Plan Red. That's America's detailed plan to fight a war against Britain on Canadian soil." So I thought, well, there you go. That's what we're going to talk about, and that will certainly appeal to Canadians and maybe some Americans. So I went back and I dug through the history of the U.S.-Canada border and the many kind of contretemps we've had since the founding of at least of the United States. All the problems start here. This is in Yorktown, the surrender of Lord Cornwallis to George Washington and General Rochambeau in 1781, and then from there to the Paris Peace Treaty, the negotiations. The British were sort of sore losers. Are there any British people in here besides me? Were kind of sore losers and refused to sit for the portrait. So the painter just painted them out, said, "Hell with you." Lord Buckingham and David Hartley were the British team, and they asked the American team, you may recognize some of those people, Benjamin Franklin, John Jay, John Adams, and Henry Lawrence. They said, well, what will it take to negotiate a peace treaty with you? And they said, and Ben Franklin said, oh, that's easy. We would like the 13 colonies plus Quebec, St. John's, Newfoundland, Rupert's Land, Nova Scotia, and Prince Edward Island. And hey, why not? We just won a war where you guys used Canada as a staging ground. And if this is truly going to be a great new North American country, we should have the colonies plus British North America. Well, this was too much for the British. And they said, no, we can't do that. So the negotiation, in fact, the British were barely willing to acknowledge the independence of the new country. So the idea of somehow both acknowledging our independence and giving us all of Canada was just not going to happen. So the negotiations dragged on for almost 2 years, and finally, in 1783, they agreed to draw a line, and here's what it says. From the Atlantic through the Great Lakes to the northwesternmost point of the Lake of the Woods, and thence on a due west course to the river Mississippi. Using this map. This map was created by a man named David Mitchell. David Mitchell was born in Virginia and went to Edinburgh to study medicine. Well, he dropped out of medical school after 2 years and moved back to Virginia to practice medicine anyway without an MD. But in his time in Scotland, he got used to the nice cold drizzle and found the heat of Virginia a little insufferable. So he and his wife moved back to England and to London, where he set up shop, not as a doctor, but as a botanist and cartographer. So while there, he made this map of North America using whatever information he could find in London, which did not include any astronomical data for latitude or longitude. So the map is full of errors. And so, for example, on this map, drawing a line from the northern west corner of Lake of the Woods to the head of the Mississippi makes sense because he has those two sort of right opposite one another. But in reality, you can't do that unless you draw a diagonal line right through Minnesota, which is what happened. And now, I don't know if any Minnesotans here, that's what the northwest angle is. The northwest angle is one of several exclaves, which are bits of the United States that are surrounded completely by Canada. So Elm Point, Minnesota, you can only get to by going through Canada, and ditto Province Point, Vermont, and Point Roberts in Washington State. So Mitchell's poor cartography, coupled with the fact that several people thought that Canada had sort of slipped through our fingers, left a group of people known as the Warhawks itching for a fight with Britain to take back the country that should have been ours. Oh, one of those was Henry Clay, Speaker of the House, nicknamed the Dictator. And I have drawn a line here. When he was looking for an excuse. The HMS Lippert fired on the Chesapeake in 1807, looking for sailors to press into service. So Clay stood up in Congress and said, "Our wrongs have been great, our cause is just, and if we are decided and firm, success is inevitable." Thomas Jefferson said that taking Canada was simply, quote unquote, a matter of marching. So they could be forgiven for thinking that victory would be easy. By this time, the US population was 8 million compared to Canada's 500,000. Canada had only 6,000 troops, or Canada, I should say, Britain had only 6,000 troops, and the States more than twice that. And Britain was bogged down at home in a bruising war against Napoleon. And many Americans were born in America or had emigrated there. In fact, British General Isaac Brock declared that most Upper Canadians were, quote unquote, essentially bad, and so American that they would welcome a regime change. So war was declared in June of 1812, but what nobody could foresee was the ineptness of American soldiers. Here's a little battle map of the Canadian front. Most of the War of 1812 was played out on the Canadian front. When I was in high school, either I didn't pay attention or we didn't spend a huge amount of time on the War of 1812, maybe because it's not a great story from the American perspective. And here are 3 battles, if you want to call them those, 3 military engagements between the United States and the British on the Canadian frontier. The first up was William Hull, who attacked Canada and managed to lose Detroit in the process. Hull was a Revolutionary War hero, and he marched his troops from Ohio up to Detroit, but not knowing that during the march the war had actually been declared. So he didn't know that sending a schooner up the Maumee River loaded with supplies, a few wounded, and secret plans for an invasion of Fort Amherstburg, which is near Mackinac Island in the Detroit River, was a bad idea. So the British intercepted this schooner and knew all about his secret invasion plan. Hull and his troops arrived in Detroit, where they found only whiskey and soap, and launched their attack on Amherstburg, presumably clean but drunk. The British, commanded by Sir Isaac Brock, were expecting him, no surprise, and Brock had adroitly enlisted the aid of sympathetic Native Americans, led by Tecumseh. Panther across the sky is what Tecumseh means. Tecumseh famously said, "Who are the white people that we should fear them? They cannot run fast and are good marks to shoot at." Hull was very easily defeated, who took the bait when Brock issued a call for surrender on the grounds that he, quote unquote, could not control the numerous body of Indians once the battle started. So Hull surrendered without a shot. He was court-martialed and sentenced to death, but the sentence was commuted due to Hull's advanced age. Next, we tried Queenston Heights, led by General Stephen Van Rensselaer. Van Rensselaer received intelligence that Brock had left the British camp, so he gave orders to attack in miserable conditions. His rousing speech was not quite Henry V. He told his miserable troops, "Neither rain, snow, or frost will prevent the embarkation." That was not enough to keep his boatsmen from deserting, taking with them all the oars for the invasion. So the disorganized Americans were gunned down and sunk in spite of greater numbers, although the British did lose Isaac Brock, who had in fact not left, had just gone for the day to Detroit and got back in time to be shot. And you see him there, lying fatally wounded, urging his troops on to rout the Americans. An increasingly worried Secretary of War, William Eustis, tried once again on the Canadian front with an attack this time on Montreal, led by Henry Dearborn, nicknamed Granny, who also expected to be welcomed by disgruntled Americans as liberators. I don't know if that sounds familiar. I think we've heard that recently. Under the cover of night in November 1812, Dearborn sent 500 of his 6,000 troops across the border, many of them suffering from dysentery, diarrhea, measles, or typhus. In the confusion of the cold and dark, the Americans accidentally opened fire on one another, and the reinforcements refused to cross the border, hearing all the chaos. Dearborn called a hasty retreat all the way back to Plattsburgh, New York. It was, a fellow officer wrote, a miscarriage without even the heroism of disaster. I'm not exactly sure what that means. So the entire campaign against Canada, 0 for 3, produced nothing but disaster, defeat, disgrace, ruin, and death, complained the Green Mountain Farmer, a Vermont newspaper. And Treasury Secretary Albert Gallatin wrote to President Madison The series of misfortunes exceeds all anticipations made even by those with the least confidence in our inexperienced officers and undisciplined men. Things were a little better on the ocean, where the U.S. Navy held its own against the mistress of the sea, the Royal Navy. The highlight was, of course, the USS Constitution, which chased down and sank the HMS Guerriere. It was only the 6th defeat for the British Navy in over 200 battles in the previous 20 years. This completely outraged the British. The London Evening Star described the upstart American Navy as a few fur-built frigates manned by a handful of bastards and outlaws. So they were upset. I won't use the P word on C-SPAN here. But happily for the British, Napoleon was defeated, and Britain could turn its attention back to its other war, and by the end of 1840, tripled the number of men in Canada to 52,000, and went on the offensive. First stop was Maine. The poorly manned Eastport surrendered without a shot. Castine, this is the British invasion map of Castine there on your right. 40 Americans looked out the window of their redoubt and saw 2,500 British troops, so they blew up their supplies and fled into the woods. Undeterred, the Brits sailed all the way up to Machias, giving them control of 100 miles of Maine coast and most of the land inland. People in Maine were offered the choice of taking an oath of allegiance to the crown or leaving. Most took the oath. It is scarcely conceivable to imagine the joy of the inhabitants, complained a local newspaper about Mainers taking the oath of allegiance. Many Mainers hoping for lower taxes and easier trade with Canada. So Washington hit back where it hurts and suspended mail service to Maine. Amazingly, this did not bring Mainers to their knees, many of whom were keen to continue illegal smuggling with Canadians. And Castine became a major R&R destination for British troops and remained under British rule until the end of war. Having essentially taken Maine, Britain turned its attention down here, and these pictures are probably familiar to you. In August 1814, they came down to the Chesapeake. British General Robert Ross complained about the American soldiers, country people who would have been much more appropriately employed attending to their agricultural occupations than in standing with muskets in their hands. These farmer soldiers fled so quickly, in 100-degree muggy DC weather and wool uniforms, to be fair, that Ross complained it precluded the possibility of many prisoners being taken. Ross and his men arrived at the White House to find the food on the table still warm, and although they judged the wine as, quote, very good, for a tip, they burned the White House, Capitol, Treasury, War, and State Departments. This was really the tipping point in an increasingly unpopular war. Our affairs, said Navy Secretary William Jones, are as gloomy as can well be. Desertion was extremely high, and executions for desertion, 13% of troops, and the nation's finances were in ruin. The U.S. government defaulted on its debt and stopped specie payments, which ironically had been flowing into Canada to finance the war. We'd been buying British bonds, $2 million in gold in 1814 alone. The Chesapeake Invasion caused a run on the banks, and with only worthless treasury notes, the administration had no money to fund the war or pay troops, many of whom were in arrears for 6 or 12 months or even more. What little money remained flowed into Canada, mostly from British troops eager for food. 2/3 of our army in Canada, boasted George Prevost, Commander-in-Chief of British America, are at this moment eating beef provided by American quote-unquote contractors, drawn principally from the states of New York and Vermont. President Madison, who was described as miserably shattered and woebegone, had little choice but to sue for peace, even though the sentiment was that America had very few cards to play at the negotiating table. The Boston Gazette conceded that having declared war and failed, the nation must now pay the price, so the Treaty of Ghent could be spun as having lost the war but won the peace. The Times of London agreed, calling the treaty deadly and disgraceful for letting the United States off without a sound flogging. Basically, the Treaty of Ghent restored the U.S.-Canada border to its 1783 definition, which left open the door to even more disputes. The first of these is the Pork and Beans War of 1839, also known as the Lumberjack War or the Aroostook War. As eager as many people in Maine had been to do business with Canadians during the War of 1812, Maine lumberjacks were fed up with people from New Brunswick coming over and stealing, quote unquote, their trees. So in early 1839, they organized a posse of militia to invade New Brunswick and capture any New Brunswick lumberjacks who were felling trees that Maine thought belonged to them. They were promptly captured by Canadian militia and marched off in chains to prison there. So the United States, I think maybe overreacted, authorized 50,000 men under the command of Winfield Scott, his nickname Old Fuss and Feathers, and $10 million to start a war against New Brunswick, to release the Maine lumberjacks. But Lord Ashburton, Chancellor of the Exchequer for Britain, was keen not to have another armed conflict with the United States and gave a good chunk of New Brunswick to the United States in order to avoid war. The whole territory we were wrangling about, he wrote later, was worth nothing. There was only one casualty, Hiram T. Smith, who either froze to death, drowned, or was run over by a cannon, or a supply wagon, or trampled by a horse, or all of the above. His grave marker is on Route US 2A in Haynesville, Maine. It's not worth the drive, I hate to say. The next one, another pork roll. I don't know what it is about pork in Canada. This one was on the West Coast. And here, because of the vagaries of Mitchell's map and the fact that it was mostly uncharted territory, it wasn't clear where the border went through San Juan Island. So both the United States and British citizens occupied San Juan Island. The British super merchant Hudson's Bay Company had a farm there and had also squatter settlers on the northern part. So one morning, an American, Lyman Cutler, looked out the window of his farmhouse and saw a British pig rooting around in his potato garden. So he did what any good American farmer squatter would do. He shot the pig dead. So this quickly escalated into an argument about whose fault that was and what reparations and claims. And in a sort of early echo of the Falkland Islands resulted in an enormous military buildup. The United States sent in 500 troops under the charge of George Pickett, who you might remember from Pickett's charge that all but lost the war for the South later on. The British sent in 5 warships and 2,000 men. And with the clear military advantage, the Governor-General of Vancouver told the British Rear Admiral to invade San Juan Island and engage the Americans. He said in reply that to engage 2 great countries in a squabble over a pig is foolish. So this war also ended with a negotiated settlement. Each side kept 100 men, one at one end of the island, one at the other. And in fact, you can go there today, and that is worth the trip. And you can see the remnants of the English and American camps on San Juan Island. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead this. We'll come back to Captain Raphael Semmes in a minute, because the Civil War was a bit complicated, a little bit complicated, because of Britain's alleged neutrality. There was an idea that maybe if we couldn't fight our way into Canada, maybe we could just buy the damn thing. And William Seward had done this with Alaska from Russia, Russian North America. Russia needed the cash, and they were eager to sell, and were afraid that Britain was going to take Alaska anyway if they had another war, which they had just concluded in the Crimea. Seward wanted it to surround British Columbia with American soil, which he saw as the first step towards the annexation of Canada. In a pincer-like move, he also sought to buy Greenland from Denmark, but Denmark was not interested. Interestingly, this idea resurfaced at the beginning of World War II. America tried to buy Greenland from Denmark to keep the Germans from building bases there, but our offer was declined. This is the check, which you might have seen before, for the purchase of Alaska from Russia. But the idea of buying Canada reached its pitch with House Resolution 754 in 1866, introduced by Massachusetts Representative Nathaniel Banks, was to assume $85 million in Canadian debt, give $10 million to the Hudson's Bay Company, and put another $50 million to shore up Canada's infrastructure. But that bill died a quiet death in committee, so some things never change. Okay, in the Civil War, as I mentioned, British was officially neutral, but like a lot of neutrality, that meant they just wanted to do trade with both sides. One of the things they did was build ships for the Confederacy, and they built this amazing ship, the CSS Alabama, and this is Captain Raphael Semmes aboard this ship, 250-foot-long sloop, which was propelled either by steam or sail. They boarded 450 Union ships, sank or burned 66 of these, and took 2,000 prisoners without a single casualty. It really was the Confederate Death Star. But worst of all, it sank the USS Griswold, which was a relief ship that left from Boston flying both Stars and Stripes and the Union Jack, headed for Lancashire, filled with corn and flour and other supplies for England's textile workers who were really suffering because they couldn't get any cotton from the South. So after the war, the Union sought reparations for the sinking of the Griswold and for the damage laid by the Alabama. They were looking for an official apology from England and reparations of several $100 million. Well, England was not about to apologize, and they didn't have several $100 million because their economy was in tatters because of the fallout from the textile industry. So we had an idea. Hamilton Fish, Grant's Secretary of State, said, "Tell you what, why don't you give us Canada and we'll just call it square?" But Britain was not going to trade Canada for Alabama. But some Irish Americans had a better idea. Why don't we trade Ireland for Canada? So are there any Canadians here who can answer for me, is this Fenian or Fenian? I would say Fenian, but my Canadian friends say Fenian. So I'll say Fenian until somebody shouts out, no, it's Fenian. There we go. Thank you. The Fenians were a group of Irish Americans, many of them Civil War vets, who founded the Fenian Brotherhood based on, and this is in their charter, their quote-unquote intense and undying hatred toward the monarchy and oligarchy of Great Britain. They quickly gained 10,000 members and over $500,000 in cash. They also called themselves the Irish Republican Army, which is the first known use of that acronym. Their crazy idea was to capture Canada and exchange it for Ireland in a kind of hostage swap. Or maybe they could found an Irish Republic in North America, or maybe they could encourage the United States to follow with troops and annex Canada. Secretary of State William Seward, looking at 1.6 million Irish voters, kind of gave tacit approval to this idea. So the Fenians, once again, expected to be welcomed as liberators, but overlooked the fact that most Canadian Irish were Protestants and not Catholic, outside of Quebec, where the Hibernians lobbied for annexation to the United States to break ties with Britain. 1866, they invaded the Indian island of New Brunswick, but were quickly turned back by Canadian militia. In June, a couple months later, they tried again, and they floated 1,000 men on barges from Buffalo, and they were defeated here in the Battle of Ridgeway by much better prepared and armed troops, and crossed back into the United States, where they were arrested for violating American neutrality laws. The arrests were mostly for show, and they were quickly released, allowing them to mount several more raids in the next couple of years. One in 1870 from Franklin, Vermont, where they had amassed 15,000 firearms and 3 million rounds of ammunition. This raid failed, and the U.S. agreed to stop looking the other way, and President Grant issued a proclamation reaffirming our Neutrality Act. But the Fenian raids had the unintended consequence of galvanizing Canadian national spirit, which may have hastened Britain granting independence. Dominion Day, July 1, 1867. This created a new country out of New Brunswick, Upper and Lower Canada, basically Ontario and Quebec, and Rupert's Land, 1.5 million square miles of land owned by the Hudson's Bay Company, most of Western Canada, as well as parts of Minnesota, Montana, and the Dakotas. The general sense was that this new Canadian nation would not survive long and would be, to quote the New York Times, peacefully absorbed into the great North American Republic. Others were more bellicose. The publisher of the St. Paul Press pushed for annexation, saying that if the Northwest technically belonged to Canada, it belonged geographically and commercially to Minnesota. In Michigan, a state senator warned, "This continent is our land, and we might as well notify the world that we will fight for it." The railroads were willing to play hardball too. The president of the Northern Pacific Railroad sent a letter to his Canadian counterpart of the Canadian Pacific that he had intentionally built the land close to the border to keep Canadians out of the Western territories, where there was some sympathy towards annexation by America, funded by some well-placed bribes. In fact, the largest hotel in Winnipeg, Emmerling's, flew the Stars and Stripes. Canada's new political status and growing national identity increased tensions with the United States. The Trent Affair of 1861, a few years earlier, was a case in point. A Confederate ship was intercepted carrying 2 diplomats, urging British recognition of the Confederacy. The immediate reaction in the Union was to declare war on England in response. So Canada readied troops, 46,000 men in arms at the U.S. border. Lincoln wisely decided that he could, quote, fight only one war at a time, so the crisis passed. Canadian nationalism reached fever pitch with World War I, when, obligated as part of its empire status to send 31,000 troops, actually sent 38,000, although many of those without training or equipment. Historians Catherine Cross and John Hughes Wilson explain that Canadian nationalism sprang not just from, I'm going to quote from their book, Darwinian ideas of racial superiority and Nietzschean influences on educated thought, but also from the unifying symbol of the British Empire. British national consciousness was inextricably entwined with imperial glory, rights, and responsibilities. The empire was a source of stability and belief in their superiority, pride, and duty. Half the globe colored pink really meant something in a way today we find incomprehensible, if not downright embarrassing. It is almost impossible for us to realize how strong a unifying feature the empire was. Imperial ties were a genuine force in 1914 and sufficient enough to pull hundreds of thousands of Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, and South Africans from the white colonial dominions back across the oceans to volunteer and fight and die for the mother country. One of these battles was at Vimy Ridge on Easter Day in 1917, where the Canadian troops won a decisive battle after the French had lost thousands of men there in the 2 years prior. Rising nationalism and success overseas spawned the creation of a new Canadian First movement. "We are a northern people," wrote one, "more manly, more real than those weak-marrowed bones and superstitions of an effeminate South." That's us. This also carried racist overtones. Canadians were stocked with sturdy Northern Europeans, Saxons, Celts, Danes, Germans, and Scandinavians, while the states were watered down with vagrant populations of Italy and other countries of Southern Europe. Indeed, one noted historian, writer, and United Empire loyalist suggested that what Canada really needed to prove its new macho identity was a rattling good war with the United States. It's not clear whether one witness to the battle at Vimy Ridge, a young Lieutenant James Sutherland Brown, known as Buster to his family and friends, no relation to the shoe or clown of the same name, if he felt this way about the United States, but he did think that war with the U.S. was inevitable and that the best defense was a good offense. After World War I, he returned to Canada and became Director of Military Operations and Intelligence and began to give the whole thing some real thought in 1920. There was good reason to think that a war between the United States and Britain was inevitable. Although we joined World War I late, we loaned the UK a huge sum for their war effort, about $22 billion, against a gross domestic product in Britain at that time of $27 billion. And a secret communique from the American ambassador in August 1920 relayed Britain's irritation that we expected the money to be repaid, and in cash or gold, no less. He warned that Britain was nervous about our becoming too serious a rival on the world stage and would, quote, try to block us at every turn and surround us with potential enemies. So Buster Brown rounded up a few of his colleagues and did some undercover espionage. There's Buster on the left, and there they are undercover. They loaded up with some Kodak brownies into a Model T and surveyed the roads and bridges of upstate New York and Vermont. Some of his field notes are hilarious. The people of Burlington, Vermont seem, quote, very affable and not as American as other U.S. cities that we have visited. In rural Vermont, he noted that Americans, if not actually lazy, have a very deliberate way of working and apparently believe in frequent rests and gossip. The women throughout the rural districts appear to be a heavy and not very comely lot. Similarly, a large number of men in the state of Vermont are fat and lazy, but pleasant and congenial. In a kind of comical echo of William Hull, Buster was convinced that invading Canadians would be welcomed, if not as liberators, then at least as bartenders, since Vermonters were eager for the drink prohibition denied them. Asking a local to identify Camel's Hump, one of Vermont's highest peaks, Brown quipped, "You people here are like the camel. You can go 7 days without a drink." He did find a large and influential number of American citizens who were not altogether pleased with democracy and have a sneaking regard for Great Britain, British law, and Constitution, and general civilization. I guess what we had was not quite civilization. On the whole, he concluded Vermont was at best an obstruction for any invading Canadian force. Here is the cover of his defense, this is very Canadian fashion. It's self-deprecatingly called Defense Scheme Number 1, even though it's a full-on invasion plan, urging utmost secrecy lest this document fall into the hands of enemies of this country. What Buster envisioned was a series of lightning raids, sting like a bee and retreat like a butterfly, blowing up bridges and roads behind, in order to buy time for the British to sail to Canada's rescue. And you can see here his five-pronged attack. If you can kind of keep that in mind, you'll recognize a mirror image of that in a minute. Like a lot of things, the United States was about a decade behind Canada, and it took us another 10 years to come up with our War Plan Red when the War Department decided they needed contingency for a war with Britain on Canadian soil. They called it an exercise in peacetime preparedness. This is the cover sheet, and then on this one you see the little declassified 1974 stamp on the bottom from your archives. And this is our version of the same thing, a six-prong attack. And I guess maybe we all agreed on what the weak points on the border were. So we envisioned a war of long duration. This was not going to be a quick lightning raid, because red, that's what we called British, although in the words of the plan are phlegmatic, they are known to fight to the finish and could muster as many as 2.5 million men in Canada within 40 days of the start of hostilities. The plan was updated in 1935 and given an extra $57 million, including money to build 3 secret air bases on the Canadian border, as well as to hold the largest peacetime war games at Fort Drum, only a grenade's lob from the border, involving 36,500 soldiers. Soon, however, Britain, Canada, and the U.S. had other enemies to fight and found themselves on the same side in World War II. Oh, that's the detailed, the East Coast version. Washington happily left spared. From a population of 11 million people, 1 million Canadians served in World War II, and from scratch built the world's 4th largest Air Force and 5th largest Navy. Perhaps in recognition of this supersized contribution, Canada and the U.S. were equal partners in NORAD, when Canada worried about being either a target or collateral damage in a bomb fest between the States and Russia. And these are the blast doors at NORAD Command Headquarters. In April, so we were good buddies during the Cold War. We sat side by side, one Canadian general and one American general at the table. After the 9/11 attacks, President Bush created NORTHCOM to, quote-unquote, conduct operations to deter, prevent, and defeat threats and aggression aimed at the United States, its territories and interests over the entire North American region, including Canada, Alaska, Mexico, the Bahamas, U.S. Virgin Islands. However, Hawaii, even pre-Obama, did not make the cut. Based in Colorado Springs, NORTHCOM has unilateral jurisdiction, and here I quote Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld, to respond to land and sea threats and attacks and other major emergencies in Canada or the United States. The fact that Prime Minister Jean Chrétien declined the invitation to join NORTHCOM is a minor detail, having similarly passed on the opportunity to send troops into Iraq. Instead, Chrétien agreed to participate in what he called a Neighborhood Watch Committee, the Bipartisan Planning Group, BPG, which morphed into the Security and Prosperity Partnership, SPP. CNN journalist Lou Dobbs speculated that SPP was a covert plan to merge the U.S. and Canada after George Bush declared a state of emergency to keep himself in office. Obama did not support the SPP and canceled it in 2009, but not until NORAD had been expanded to include at least maritime awareness. So in effect, we kind of got NORAD, and we got NORTHCOM by expanding the definition of NORAD. War Plan Red and Defense Scheme Number 1 seem a bit silly now, since our two countries have slipped quietly into peace and our economies and cultures are so intertwined. We are each other's largest trading partner. Our trade last year with Canada was $617 billion versus $536 billion with China, and a deficit of only $32 billion versus $315 billion respectively. 74% of Canadian exports come here, and 51% of its imports come from the States. 1 in 10 Canadians live or work in the United States, including 250,000 in Hollywood and 350,000 in New York City, making New York City Canada's 15th largest city by population. And here I made a little chart showing that we snuck in there at the bottom. 700,000 First Nation and Native Americans have dual citizenship, U.S. and Canadian passports, which makes that larger than the state of Alaska. And more than 60 million border crossings are made every year, 2/3 by Americans coming south and 1/3 by Americans heading north. So for all intents and purposes, I think you can argue that we have achieved some sort of annexation of one another. There's a serious book on this subject by a Canadian journalist, Diane Francis, called Merger of the Century, in which she has a very detailed argument about why we should form, at the very least, a kind of a North American Union like the European Union, that together our economy would be so dominant and our military so dominant that we would be set for the long term. There are some reasons, however, I should say, with apologies to our Canadian friends here, to consider, maybe not to file War Plan Red away forever, to consider an invasion or an annexation of Canada. Canada has the world's second largest reserve of oil in the world after Saudi Arabia, and they have 20% of the world's fresh water, which many think will be the cause of future global conflicts. They have a functioning healthcare system and a semi-functioning political system, longer life expectancy and lower rates of cancer, stroke, heart disease, and infant mortality. They are a happier nation, 7th according to the Columbia University's World Happiest Report, next to our number 17. And if you believe that global warming will continue to melt the Northwest Passage, they will have one of the hemisphere's 2 navigable cross-continental sea passages, and maybe the only one if the Panama Canal is ever closed for political or natural reasons. So they bring some stuff to the table. I honestly had a harder time thinking why Canada might want to blow the dust off of Defense Scheme Number 1 and invade the United States. Here's the best I could come up with. Miles of warm southern beaches, although many of these are already occupied by Canadians in the winter months. Repatriation of many celebrities, Mike Myers, William Shatner, Joni Mitchell, Justin Bieber, and Celine Dion, who was recently ranked as America's favorite American singer. I think Americans don't even know that she's Canadian. And the real prize, I think, is the Zamboni Company, which is located in California. Plus, if Canada took over the United States, the Stanley Cup would never leave. And we do think about it. Representative Dan Coates, Republican of Indiana, said in a Senate Defense Appropriations hearing last June that the Pentagon has a contingency plan on the shelf for just about every scenario, including an invasion of Canada. And then, real quickly, I'll just scroll. These are, in the book, there are full-text transcripts of both Defense Scheme Number 1 and War Plan Red. And you can see back in the day, we could list, this is all their ships, the tonnage, the names. we could do a real detailed inventory of everything Canada had. Maybe that's in some giant database, because I got a feeling now it's too big. And ditto defense scheme number 1. The first thing apparent in the defense of Canada is that we lack depth. I think there was a 15-to-1 population gap in 1920. And so this is Buster Brown's thinking about future wars, Europeans, United States, Japan, or a combination of all the above attacking Canada. So I don't want to. I'm happy that none of this ever happened, but it's fun to look back and see what might have been, or at least what some people thought might have been. I would be happy to answer any questions or hear any speculations about reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. Curious, I guess, for the plans of each country looking into taking over the other, if Canada, as part of the Commonwealth, felt that the British would have come to their saving.
That was completely the plan.
Yes.
That was Buster Brown's plan. He would basically invade quickly to buy time for the British to get here. The British, however, were always a little ambivalent about just how much the Canadians could count on them, and sent mixed messages throughout certainly the 19th century. On the one hand, you're part of the empire. We will use all available means to defend you. And on another hand, when approached by American politicians who asked, how would you feel about an annexation of Canada, the reply was, if Canada wants to go, we won't stand in the way. So it was, I think Canada counted on that, but who can tell? It probably depended what was going on at home.
A few blocks from here, in 1969, Pierre Trudeau gave a speech at the National Press Club, and he quoted his distinguished and often drunk predecessor, Sir John A. Macdonald, from an 1867 letter to a gentleman named Mr. Maine, who lived in Calcutta, India. And one sentence from the letter was, "War will come someday between England and the United States, and India could do us yeoman service by sending an army of Sikhs, Gurkhas, and Baluchis, etc., across the Pacific to San Francisco, and holding that beautiful and immoral city with the surrounding California as security for Montreal and Canada." Maybe that's in your book.
No, it should be, though. John A. Macdonald is fascinating, and that was one of the great pleasures, actually, of doing this book, was to learn more about that man. He's an incredible man. He put Canada together more or less single-handedly, while usually on a bender. There's a great biography of Sir John A. Macdonald, which I recommend to all of you. In the War Plan Red, we anticipated that the British were going to bring over what the plan called colored troops, people, Sikhs and Indians and other people from the far reaches of the British Empire, troops not to be underestimated. Along with it notes the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Also a force that we shouldn't underestimate. So the War Plan Red anticipated that these 2.5 million men would in fact arrive within a few weeks of outbreak of war. And though some of these would be British, most of them would be troops, and that those troops were excellent fighters. There is a letter in the book, a draft of a speech that FDR delivered when he accepted an honorary doctorate at Queenston, where, in fact, the Defense Scheme Number 1 documents are housed, in which he said, we are such good friends, we are such great neighbors because we don't engage in any kind of secret diplomacy behind each other's back. This is, I think, only a few months after he signed off on building some fake Air Force bases near the Canadian border. So, anyway, thanks for bringing up Sir John A. Oh, sorry.
you and the people who are interested enough in the topic to attend this lecture might be interested to know about a Nova Scotian writer of the last generation called Thomas Raddall, who wrote historical novels and works of history that are very interesting. One of the most interesting is called His Majesty's Yankees. It's about the province of Nova Scotia and how nearly Nova Scotia was the 14th colony to join the other 13 in fighting the American Revolution. But I discovered Raddall a year or two ago.
Rattle, R-A-T-T-L-E?
No,
Like,
R-A-D-D as in David.
L-E?
A-L-L, Raddall.
R-A-D-D-A-L.
A-L-L.
Okay, good. Go buy some books. I will. Thank you for that.
Hi. So all this being the case, how would you summarize the inability of the United States to take Canada? I mean, was their economy strong and independent? Did they get a lot from Britain? Couldn't we interrupt supplies and arms and things like that? So
In the 19th century?
just overall,
Overall?
I'm asking you for the whole scheme of things.
Well,
Why?
in the 19th century, for the most part, Canada was an extremely poor and agricultural nation. It didn't even have a standing army until 1899 when, by obligation of treaty, they had to muster some troops to go fight the Boer War with the British. The RCMPs came out of the Northwest Mounted Police, which was a small force basically aimed to fight liquor runners in British Columbia. And they had like 450 men. I have the details. And an almost equal number of cattle and other livestock. I don't know why you needed livestock to fight liquor runners. But I think there was a sense that Canada would basically at some point need to be part of the United States, that economically it could not stand on its own. And a lot of newspaper editorials and a lot of writers certainly throughout the 19th century thought it was just a matter of time before Canada would be absorbed into the Union, just out of more of financial and economic necessity, and that probably we didn't need to waste men and bullets having that fight for something that was going to come our way, one way or the other. After that, I think certainly by now, in WikiLeaks there was a document about the North American Initiative, which was a document about how to quote unquote sell the idea of a U.S.-Canada merger to the Canadians. So the idea is not dead by a long stretch, but I assume at this point it would be either by mutual agreement or some sort of passive-aggressive war. Instead of cutting off mail service, we cut off internet service. or ATM machines. I mean, take away my ATM and my internet service. I'll become Canadian in a matter of minutes. So,
Thank you.
I believe you have a poster up, and I assume that's the West Coast and what would be called the Pig War, and that was possibly a close call. Were there any other things later in history, skirmishes for liquor or other things that you talked about, I guess, false Air Force bases and things, but that shots were fired or things were close to be fired or anything like that occurred?
let's see, after the Pig War.
So I'm talking about the 20th century, with the plan in the 20s or 30s or any of that period.
No, there were no, that I know of, there were no almost wars like the Pig War. There are still some border disputes. Seal Island, which is Machias Seal Island off the coast of Maine, is an unresolved border dispute between the United States and Canada. And I think it's sort of maybe jointly held. It's maybe officially American territory, but there are 2 Canadian lighthouse keepers who live there 9 months out of the year. But I don't think either country really feels like pressing it. There was an American guy who used to sail out, and it mostly involves lobster pots. Who gets to put their lobster pots near Machias Seal Island? There was an American lobsterman who would go out on an annual sail just to plant an American flag in front of the Canadian lighthouse keepers, just as a kind of reminder. But that's as close as there is today, and I don't think any shots have been fired other than verbal shots about that, thankfully. Hi. Other speakers?
There's sometimes been. You'll have to go to the microphone.
Issues of war aside, there are sometimes significant trade disputes over timber, over fishing rights between the two countries. Is that an outgrowth of these earlier low-level conflicts, or is that completely based on commerce?
No, I think absolutely. Also, in 1968 or 1969, we sent the icebreaker, the USS Manhattan, through the Northwest Passage without asking permission, without notifying the Canadians, and that caused a great deal of upset. And after a kind of verbal war between Canada and the United States over that, we agreed that in the future we would notify Canada first. We were going to send one of our ships through what they see as their territorial waters. But the United States at that time said, we do not recognize your claim to territoriality over the Arctic portion of the Northwest Passage. So I think that's probably still in the unresolved category. But there's, as I say in the book, there's hard not to detect the snare of a bully in that. Well, we're going to tell you about it because we don't think you can do anything about it. Vladimir Putin planted at the bottom on the Russian side a metal plaque. Incredibly, he did not do this himself or bare-chested. At the bottom saying that the Arctic is Russian, exclamation mark. So he also has some skin in that game, I think. No pun intended. And that's one of the arguments in Diane Francis's book, which is that together the United States and Canada can fight off any Russian threat. And in fact, the Canadian border with Russia is, at least until recently, is defended by a volunteer militia of Canadians using Enfield rifles, they use Enfield rifles, which are World War I vintage, which is what Buster Brown imagined would be the weapon of choice for
Where do
defense
they
of
have a
number
border
one.
with Russia? Above Alaska, or?
But yeah, British Columbia and north of that. But I think most of our lobster and timber and fishing rights have been either resolved or we just helped ourselves. Okay, anyway, thank you very much. And as a publisher, I would be completely remiss in not telling you that there's going to be a little book sale and signing upstairs immediately following. So if you're feeling so inclined, please come up and buy a book. I'd be happy to sign it. Thank you for your time.